rewind off so much.
But I have way in sense like one video like Argentina without the it's like Buenos Aires without the Argentina.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Sweetha, you're still there? Okay. Okay. Well, we're gonna get started in just a couple minutes.
Ah, ou alors je peux avoir comme ça, je reste à la vidéo là et on met des slides sur celui-là.
Bon, en fait, le seul truc, c'est qu'il faut penser à ceux qui vont regarder ta vidéo. Qui vont vouloir suivre ta présentation.
Ok,
donc là, c'est plus pour eux. Et là, c'est plus pour la vidéo qu'on est en train d'enregistrer.
Ok, très bien.
All right, everyone. So this is Emmanuel Guerin, who will be giving you a presentation on climate change and more specifically on deep decarbonization pathways. This lecture will be recorded, so if he's looking at the computer from time to time, you'll understand why. The presentation will last about 35 minutes or so, and then you'll have a chance to ask questions. There's also some questions from the global MDP students, but you have priority, so take advantage. Okay, so with no further ado.
Merci beaucoup, Nora. Bonjour à tous, and good afternoon to everybody. In fact, good morning to those of you in the US. As Nora said, my name is Emmanuel Guerin, and I'm part of the French government, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I'm the special advisor to the ambassador in charge of climate change negotiations, who is also the representative of the French government for the preparation of COP21. And I am, in fact, a former colleague of Nora, because before that, I used to be working at IDRI as the director for energy and climate change. So I'll start very quickly with the presentation. I don't know if we can put it on screen here, but as Nora said, I'd like to rush pretty quickly through the presentation itself. The presentation is basically on the science and the economics of climate change, but also energy. But I'd like to make sure that you've got enough time for questions, I guess, more on the politics also of these issues, because obviously I'm deeply involved into the climate negotiations these days and on the preparation of COP21. And I'm sure you do have plenty of questions on what's going to happen in Paris in a couple of weeks from now. So just a few slides to start with to frame the lecture. And I thought I should do something slightly different from what I usually do when I lecture on climate change. And this is because now we have the Sustainable Development Goal framework to talk about the links in between climate change, mitigation, and adaptation, but also some other very important and related sustainable development issues. So you just have on this slide a number of SDGs I consider to be particularly relevant for the lecture today. And this is, of course, first and foremost, SDG number 13 on climate change, but also SDG number 7 on access to sustainable energy for all, SDG number 8 on sustainable economic growth more broadly, and SDG number 9 on a number of related topics such as infrastructure, industrialization, and innovation. So basically, and just to be clear, what I'll do is use climate change, mostly climate change mitigation, by the way, even if I'll touch on the issue of climate change adaptation, but I'll use that as the framework for the lecture, but I'll explore the links with energy access and energy security. There are obviously very important links here because approximately 75% of the greenhouse gases emissions come from the burning of fossil fuel energy. I'll also discuss the links between climate change mitigation and economic growth, but also the issue of jobs, as this is very important both economically but also in the political debate. And I'll conclude by saying a few words about the need to reorient all the investment flows consistently with the climate change mitigation and adaptation objectives. So a few words about finance, but also a few words about technology. And I'll stress the importance of scaled up investment into low carbon technology innovation. So that is in essence the framing and the scope of the lecture today. But let me start with the objective of the limitation to the temperature increase. And basically what you have on this graph, so I extracted this graph from the IPCC latest assessment report. So the 5th assessment report of the IPCC is an acronym that stands for Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It published its 5th assessment report just a few months ago on the run-up to COP21, and the working group 2 on which this graph is extracted is basically looking at the issue of the impacts of climate change and adaptation to climate change. And you basically have on this graph a series of risks and threats associated to different levels of temperature increase. So that's what you have on the vertical axis to this graph, the different levels of temperature increase compared to the pre-industrial level. And the different types of risks you can see on this graph are basically the risks of unique and threatened systems, extreme weather events, the distribution of impacts across the globe, as well as the global aggregate impacts and the risk of large-scale singular events. It also, what you have also on the graph is the level of temperature increase that already occurred since the pre-industrial level, mainly as a result of the emission, the anthropogenic emission of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and that's approximately 0.8 degrees Celsius of temperature increase. And what you have on the title of this graph, and what I really need you to remember, is the fact that we have agreed politically, and let me stress the word politically, to limit the mean surface temperature increase to below 2 degrees Celsius compared to the pre-industrial level. That's a decision that was taken in Cancun in 2010. And I think it's very important to understand that this is an objective that was taken politically in the climate negotiations, even if, of course, it is guided and informed by science. I mean, this graph is an explanation of how it is guided by science, but I just want to stress the fact that ultimately this is a political objective, because setting this target implies making judgment on, for example, the level of risk that is considered acceptable by society at large, but also different parts of the society, and it also requires making judgment about how you value the future compared to how you value the present. So 2 degrees C, extremely important number to remember, political objective guided by science. Then I want you to understand what are the implications in terms of reducing the global greenhouse gases emissions if the objective is to stay below 2 degrees Celsius of mean surface temperature increase. So this is another graph that comes from the IPCC Fifth Assessment Report. This time it comes from the Working Group 3 of the IPCC, because this is the working group that looks at mitigation, so how to reduce greenhouse gases emissions. And it basically shows you a range of different types of scenarios. So in red, you've got more or less the business as usual scenarios. So what happens if we don't do more than what we currently do to reduce greenhouse gases emissions. And in blue, and this is what I want you to focus on, you've got a range of scenarios that are compatible with the limitation of the temperature increase to below 2 degrees Celsius. And there is a set of numbers I really want you to remember. The first is that basically to limit the temperature increase to below 2 degrees Celsius, we need to reach net zero greenhouse gases emissions sometimes before the end of the century. Net zero greenhouse gases emissions. We need to reduce them very significantly also as soon as 2050. We need to reduce them by somewhere in between 40% to 70% in 2050 compared to the level more or less today, right, in 2010. So these two numbers I want you to remember because they are how you translate into greenhouse gases emission reductions, the objective of keeping the temperature increase below 2 degrees Celsius. So zero, net zero, sometimes before the end of the century, and reduced by somewhere in between 40 to 70% in 2050 compared to today's level. Then I want to look at a different time frame, more short term, because you know that this is also the time frame that is relevant for the climate negotiations and the COP21, and in particular the targets, the emission reduction targets that the countries set for themselves, what is called in the negotiations the INDCs, and the acronym stands for Intended Nationally Determined Contributions. And these mitigation targets go to 2025 or 2030. So basically what you have on this graph, which I took from the UNEP emissions gap report, is the level of emission to 2025 and 2030. So on completely on the right, it's the level, completely on the right, it's the level in 2050. So the range in between 18 and 25 gigatons, so it's billion tons of CO2 emissions with the average 22 gigaton. It's the level in 2050 that is compatible with the limitation of the temperature increase to below 2 degrees Celsius. The range in between 40 to 30, to 44 with the average at 42 is the level in 2030. And the range between 40 and 48 with the average in at 47 is the level in 2025. And I just wanted to zoom in into this time frame because, as I said, this is 2025 or 2030 is the time frame that is relevant for the individual targets that countries set for themselves for COP21 in Paris at the end of the year. So you might have heard about the European Union, for example, taking a commitment to reduce its emissions by at least 40% in 2030 compared to the level in 1990. You might have heard about China committing to a peak in its carbon emission by around 2030. You might have heard about the US committing to reducing its emissions by somewhere in between 26 and 28% in 2025 compared to the level in 2005. Basically, you need to add them up, all of them, look at the aggregate impact and result of these mitigation contributions and see how they compare with the level of emissions globally that is consistent with the limitation of the temperature increase to below 2 degrees Celsius. If you do that, and you might have seen in the press lately that some in particular, the Executive Secretariat of the UN Convention on Climate Change have done that. For the time being, the mitigation contributions that have been made by individual countries are a very significant step in the right direction because they represent a much higher deviation from business as usual than what we had in the past in Kyoto or even in Copenhagen, but they're still insufficient to limit the temperature increase to below 2 degrees Celsius. So the purpose of the negotiation in Paris is also to find the ways to revise progressively these mitigation targets. So the review clause in the agreement is going to be very important, but also to define the collective actions that can be taken together by countries and non-state actors to allow them to progressively increase their level of ambition. But I wanted to zoom on the time frame to 2025 and 2030 because this is what is relevant for these mitigation contributions, and in a way it sets the benchmark. Okay, let me continue on the other computer, and the slides are going to come back on the screen. Yeah, another important and simple message I wanted to convey is that, in essence, to limit the temperature increase to below 2 degrees Celsius, what we need to do, again, not tomorrow, but over the course of the century, is to shift to ultimately 100% clean energy system. I said there were very important links between climate change mitigation and energy because roughly 75% of the global greenhouse gases emissions come from the burning of fossil fuels, so oil, gas, and coal. And in the end, to reach net zero greenhouse gases emissions overall, what we need to do as part of that global effort on the energy sector in particular is to transition to 100% clean energy system. There are different technological options to do this, which we can group basically into 3 categories. I mean, the first is renewable energies, so wind, solar, geothermal, and other types of renewable energies. The second is nuclear, with of course an open debate in different countries about the opportunity or not and the feasibility or not of nuclear. And the third type of technical options is the use of a technology that is called carbon capture and sequestration, which can either be deployed on fossil fuel generation, so coal-fired power plants, or a cement factory, for example. And another different technology is the direct air capture. So these 2 types of carbon capture and sequestration technologies exist. They're proven at the demonstration stage, but their feasibility for the large-scale deployment is also is still uncertain, and they also, of course, have a cost which needs to be confronted also to the other options to produce low or even zero carbon energy. So that was for one part of the energy equation in a 2 degrees C world. But I also want to stress that the issue in the energy sector is broader than just relying on low or zero carbon sources of energy production. You can think of the agenda in a way for the energy sector to be able to stay within the 2 degrees C global carbon budget as having three main parts. The first and very important one, in many ways, the first is energy efficiency and conservation. So using less energy per unit of output. The second is the decarbonization of electricity generation in particular. And the third is fuel switching. So what you see in most of the scenarios that show you how technically it is feasible to limit the temperature increase to below 2 degrees Celsius is that because it is possible technically to completely decarbonize the production of electricity, you also see electricity playing a more important role in the energy metrics. So some of the energy consumptions that used to take place through the use of fuels happen through the consumption of electricity. But again, I don't want to give the impression that climate change mitigation is only about doing things in the energy sector. I showed you with the previous graphs that the energy sector is a very important part of any successful mitigation scenario, the transformation of the energy sector. But it's also true that if we want to limit the temperature increase to below 2 degrees Celsius, you need to transform basically all the sectors of the economy and not just the energy sector, but also, and you can see that on this graph, the land use sector, the transport sector, the building sector, the industry sector, and all the sectors that are responsible for the emissions of non-CO2 greenhouse gases emissions. And you see that basically the emissions in the land use sector need to go down to 0 by the end of the century. And so do the emissions in the buildings sector. The emissions in the industry sector and in the transport sector are slightly positive, but very close to 0, and compensated by net negative emissions in the electricity sector. And in these models, this is made possible in particular as a result of the use of a technology that is called bioenergy plus carbon capture and sequestration. So you basically combine the use of bioenergy with the use of carbon capture and sequestration, resulting in net negative emissions. Let me mention a few words, as I said at the beginning, on the links between climate change mitigation and energy access and energy security, because I think it's extremely important to understand that there is no way in which we're going to solve the climate issue, and therefore no way in which we're going to be able to reduce the greenhouse gases emissions to a level that is deep enough to make it possible to limit the temperature increase to below 2 degrees Celsius if we don't provide in the meantime the access to sustainable and modern form of energy for all, because it cannot be that it comes at the expense of the access to energy by people in developing countries, and in particular in the least developed countries, that we manage to control the risks of climate change. So we need to find a way to do both. We need to find a way to increase the use of energy, and also the use of energy per capita and the use of energy per unit of output in developing countries, while at the same time reducing to 0 in the end the greenhouse gases emissions globally. And this graph is basically the result of a project that is carried out by IDRI, the French Institute for Sustainable Development and International Relations, and the SDSN, the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, a project that is called the Deep Decarbonization Pathways Project. And it basically shows the emission reduction trajectories in 15 countries, the 15 largest emitters of greenhouse gases that are compatible with the limitation of the temperature increase to below 2 degrees Celsius. And the result I want to show you with this graph is that basically for the developing countries in the project, or in fact, the big emerging countries in the project, so India, South Africa, Indonesia, Brazil, China, and Mexico, what you have in between 2050 and today is an increase in the energy per capita in between today and 2050. Whereas what you have in developed countries in the project, so Germany, UK, Japan, France, Australia, US, Canada, and others, is a decrease in the amount of energy per capita as a result of energy efficiency, not as a result of poor energy services. But I just wanted to illustrate with this graph that it is the case that in developing countries, climate change mitigation can be combined with higher energy use, and that is very important. Of course, it also needs to be coupled with a decarbonization of the production and the consumption of energy, including in these countries. But with this graph also taken from the report of the Deep Decarbonization Pathways Project, I just want to illustrate the fact that there are different ways in which countries can do that, can produce essentially zero carbon electricity by 2050, and the power mix, so the mix of technologies you can use to produce electricity in 2050, is also going to vary across countries depending on two things, generally speaking, depending on the natural resources in these countries. I mean, whether or not they have renewable energy resources, whether or not they have fossil fuel energy resources, but also on the social preferences in these countries. So some countries might choose to rely on nuclear, some of them might choose not to rely on nuclear. So you just have on this graph an example of what the power mix in these 15 countries could be, while at the same time reducing emissions to a level that makes it possible to limit the temperature increase to below 2 degrees Celsius. But again, this is just an example that was produced by teams of experts in these countries. But it also needs to be the matter of a political and social discussion in all of these countries to choose what is the most appropriate energy mix to reduce greenhouse gases emissions. With this graph, also taken from the Deep Decarbonization Pathways Project, I wanted to illustrate the fact that climate change mitigation and even deep emission reductions are compatible with continued and in some cases very strong economic growth, right? So it's not the fact that there is a trade-off in between reducing greenhouse gases emissions and ensuring economic growth. You have on this graph, on the vertical axis, the different rates of average GDP growth for the 15 countries I mentioned in between today, so well, 2010 and 2050 in these scenarios. And you can see that in particular for the emerging economies included in the project, the average rates of GDP growth are not only positive, but extremely high. I mean, India, for example, scores at over 6% of GDP growth on average through the period to 2050. Mexico, Brazil, and South Africa somewhere in between 2 and 3, and the developed countries in the project, yes, slower rates of GDP growth, but still positive and somewhere in between 1 and 2.5. In any case, I wanted to hammer the fact that there is no trade-off in between reducing greenhouse gases emissions to avoid dangerous climate change and continued GDP growth. But it's true that there is a tension between the level at which greenhouse gases needs to be reduced to be consistent with the limitation of the mean surface temperature increase below 2 degrees Celsius, and the rhythm at which they can be reduced to maintain strong and economic growth and equitable social just 2 more points before I conclude the lecture and open the floor to questions. The first is that it's extremely important to understand that yes, there is a need for higher incremental investment to pay for low carbon sources of energy in particular compared to high carbon sources of energy. But fundamentally, what is at stake is not just how to pay in the short term for slightly higher cost, but how to reorient all the investment flows consistently with the mitigation and adaptation objectives. There is a clear benefit in doing that in the long run, because it is much more profitable to invest today in these low carbon solutions than to continue with the high carbon paths. But in the meantime, they require slightly higher capital expenditures in the short term. So we need to invent financial systems and regulations that are capable of paying for this extra cost, but also reorienting all the investment flows. And finally, the point I wanted to stress to conclude is that, yes, we have plenty of technologies that make it possible today to reduce incrementally the greenhouse gases emissions compared to the business as usual scenario. But in the meantime, if we want to deeply reduce greenhouse gases emissions, and as I said, eventually go to net zero greenhouse gases emissions, we need to deploy technologies that are either not yet completely demonstrated, at least at the large scale, or whose cost is still too high compared to their high carbon alternatives. You can think in particular of carbon capture and sequestration. You can think about electric vehicles. You can also even include the new generations of solar PV energy in this category. So the point I wanted to make is that it's extremely important to dramatically increase the level of public and private investments we make in low carbon technology innovations. And it's true that it's both public and private investments. It's not only public. But if you look, for example, at the latest report from the International Energy Agency, it says that we need to triple the current level of investment in clean energy research and development to have a chance of limiting the temperature increase to below 2 degrees Celsius. So I wanted to leave it to you with this note, but as I said, I am more than happy to respond both to any clarification question on the presentation itself that focused mainly on the science and the economics of climate change mitigation and its relation with energy access and energy security, but also to respond to any question you might have more on the politics of climate change and what's happening these days in the climate negotiations, and what is really at stake for the COP21, and what we can expect from it. Thank you.
Okay, so does anyone have any questions? And if so, please use your microphone so that we can hear you here for the recording purposes.
About the 2-degree that you mentioned, but a lot of scientists are actually saying that we're more likely to so is 2 going to make an impact, or is it enough, or is this just a more of a political thing? And yes, we agreed on 2 degrees, but the data is saying that 2 will maybe have an impact, and with guarantee not to maybe go above.
So there are 2 different things, right, in your question. I mean, there is the projected level of temperature increase resulting from, by the way, it can be 2 things. I mean, either the targets that we already have and the policies that we are already implementing, and the new targets that countries, as I said, set for themselves for the period to 2025 or 2030, and that will be included into the Paris Agreement. So that's one thing. I mean, you can look at the projections resulting from the current efforts or the planned efforts. And here you're right that if you, as I said, add up the different targets to 2025 or 2030 that we currently have, we're not yet on a trajectory that is consistent with the limitation of the temperature increase to below 2 degrees Celsius. You've got different estimates coming from different institutions or experts, because calculating the level of temperature increase resulting from targets to 2025 or 2030 requires making lots of assumptions, because we're talking about an eventual temperature increase when the targets are only to 2025 or 2030. So the first level of uncertainty is, well, what do you assume the action to be post 2025 or 2030, right? That's a big factor of uncertainty. Another one, because of the way in which some targets are expressed, is what's going to be the level of GDP growth in the big emerging economies. It's important because China has said that it will peak its emission in 2030. And India and many other emerging countries or developing economies have said, well, we're going to reduce our emissions compared to the business as usual scenario. But what is this business as usual scenario? So another factor of uncertainty is the projected level of economic growth in these countries. The third level of uncertainty is that some countries have said, well, here is what we're going to do on our own. Here is what we could do in addition to what we're going to self-finance if other countries, and in particular developed countries, bring the financial and technological support that we need. So what I want to say is that you've got a high number of uncertainties, but basically these studies are saying with the current targets we have on the table for 2025 or 2030, it leads to a temperature increase that is somewhere in between 2.7 degrees Celsius and a bit above 3, maybe 3.2, maybe 3.5, and again, I mean, some would say even high. Lots of uncertainties, but this is the range. It's probably closer to 3 than 2. But this is only one part of your question, right? The other part is, well, okay, that's the projected level of increase, but what should be the objective? And that's what I said. I mean, I want you to understand that the 2 degrees C limit in the end is a political objective. It's guided by science because you can unpack the implications of going to 2 or going to 1 or going to 3. but it requires making a judgment about the level of risk that you consider to be acceptable. I mean, in particular, all the small island and developing states in the negotiations are saying, well, 2 degrees C shouldn't be the limit, it should be 1.5, because above 1.5, there is a very high risk that we simply disappear. So we cannot accept 2 degrees C to be the limit, we would like 1.5 to be the limit. We also have scientists, climate scientists, a former colleague of mine at Columbia University, Jim Henson, who say, well, even 1.5 is too much. I mean, 1 should be the limit, because if you look at the long-term projection, in particular in terms of sea level rise, if you go above 1, well, that's a risk that is way too high to be taken, and we don't know how we would adapt to it. In the meantime, you've got economists saying, well, okay, but given where we are, limiting the temperature increase to below 2 is already very challenging. What I want to say, and to summarize, is that it's extremely important to have an objective as a benchmark to guide an increase in the emission by countries, because if we didn't have that, yes, we would continuously increase the level of temperature. And it is absolutely true that 2 degrees C is still feasible, and it is probably cost beneficial to stay within this limit, just because beyond that, there is a level of risk that is very unclear how we would adapt to it. So it's not as simple as simply doing a cost-benefit analysis, but this is the objective we have. It is still within reach. It is not yet reached with the current level of mitigation contributions we have for 2025 or 2030, and this is why these contributions will have to be increased, and why the Paris Agreement will have to include a solid review clause. Yeah.
I have 2 questions related to the atomic energy.
Mm-hmm.
As you know, first source of energy is atomic. So when we are talking about the decarbonization, we need the end of the nuclear power plant here in France. I would like to know what is the policy, how and when France plans to end with the atomic energy. And secondly, I would like to know how is the polluter paying policy in the atomic energy sector.
Should we take a couple
Sure.
more questions?
Yes.
Viviana? I can hear. Hello? Hello?
I just have a question. Let's say that the countries really commit with the 2 degrees. Are we going to see changes in the real life of people? And which will be those changes?
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions?
Okay. So first on nuclear energy. So nuclear is theoretically and technically one of the options in which you can produce electricity without emitting CO2, without emitting greenhouse gases. So what I said in my lecture is that nuclear energy can be part of a power mix that is compatible with the need to reduce greenhouse gases emissions at a level that is consistent with the 2 degrees C limit. But I also said, when I looked at the country case studies, is that, well, of course, there is a political and social debate on the pros and cons of nuclear energy that is not the same in the different countries. So I didn't want to prejudge what would be the decision made by these different countries with respect to nuclear energy. And you know that the decision, for example, that was taken by Germany has nothing to do with the decision that was taken by France and the decision that is taken by China, for example. So in principle, yes, nuclear energy can be part of a decarbonized power mix. It's going to vary across countries whether or not it is used as one of the potential solutions. The question on 2 degrees C and the changes that are associated to that level of temperature increase is a very good question, because very often people assume that we choose a level of temperature increase that means that basically this is business as usual. And this is certainly not the case. I mean, even if we limit the temperature increase to below 2 degrees Celsius, we're going to see very significant changes in lots of parameters in the climate system that mean that we will have to adapt to them. And in some instances and in some regions and countries, it's not going to be easy. First, because when we talk about an average temperature increase of 2 degrees Celsius, there is a difference around the average, right? So some regions of the world would experience a temperature increase that is much higher than 2 degrees Celsius. And sadly, this is the regions of the world which are already very hot and already experiencing weather stresses. You can think in particular of the Mediterranean, part of the Arab world, part of the Sahel, and other regions. And even in a 2 degrees C scenario, these regions experience the level of temperature increase that is closer to 4 or 5 or 6. So that's a real problem related in particular to weather stress and agriculture and all the impacts on migration and conflicts, etc. But you also have many changes related to extreme weather events, typhoons and others, the monsoon patterns, the rainfall patterns more generally. And as I said, the sea level rise that is associated even to a temperature increase of 1 degree Celsius is already very significant, and even more if we go to 2. So it's extremely important to understand that limiting the temperature increase to below 2 degrees Celsius first doesn't mean the same thing for every region of the world, and second is very different from business as usual. We'll have to adapt to this. It's just that if we go beyond that level of temperature increase, it even becomes very difficult to think about, even without talking about the cost of it, it becomes very difficult to think about how we could adapt to this.
Are there any other questions here in the room? Should we address maybe 2 or 3 questions from the MDP students worldwide? So one question is, would it be more of a priority for developed countries to engage in new technologies, such as geoengineering, carbon capture sequestration, than to politically engage in low carbon economy and greenhouse gas emission reductions? That's one question. Another by Bruno Machado. Knowing that oil companies finance many governments, what influence do they have in achieving the goals proposed by SDG?
That's where is the question? Sorry.
So these 2.
Okay. Okay. So first, the question on technologies and developed versus developing countries. Yes, it's true that at least for the time being, the developed countries have higher capacities to invest into new and more advanced low carbon technologies. So it's primarily for them to invest more into the research and the development and the demonstration of these technologies. And as they do that, the price of these technologies will go down. Hopefully the efficiency of these technologies will also improve. And in the end, this is a common good, that the price of these technologies go down, and that their efficiency goes up, and therefore the developing countries will benefit from it. It's also true that there is a real need to facilitate the access to the existing technologies by developing countries who need it and do not necessarily have the means to pay for them or to deploy them. So there is an important part of the negotiation that is about technology development and transfer, and finding the ways in which the developed countries can support the deployment of the existing technologies in developing countries, and in particular reinforce their capacity to deploy these technologies. But I don't want to give the false impression that the world is divided in between developed and developing countries, especially when it comes to technology innovation. Because what you see is that the large emerging economies, so the China, the India, the Brazil, the Mexico, the South Korea, I mean, you can add many examples. They're already major players in technology innovation generally, by the way, but also specifically on low carbon technology innovation. So in fact, as part of the diplomatic effort for COP21, we're trying to build an alliance of developed and emerging countries, committing to scale up their public investment in low carbon technology research, development, and demonstration. And we have India very interested in the initiative. We have China very interested in the initiative, also Brazil and Indonesia. So they, of course, see their interest in investing themselves in the research and the development of these low carbon technologies. Of course, it doesn't prevent the fact that we should also find ways to facilitate the access to existing low carbon technologies in the least developed countries. Then the question on the oil companies is an interesting one, because I mean you've maybe seen some interesting developments in the oil and gas sector lately. In particular, a group of companies, all of them except one European oil companies. The exception is Saudi Aramco from Saudi Arabia, but all the others are Europeans, and we don't have yet any American oil companies as part of this group. But there is a movement in the oil and gas sector to, well, take note first of the objective of limiting the temperature increase to below 2 degrees Celsius, but also to be clear about what the implications of staying within this limit are. In particular, the fact that it requires that many of the reserves for fossil fuels, many of the proven reserves for fossil fuels, will have to be left under the ground and unexploited. And then to work together on an agenda for the transition to low carbon economy. So initiatives on to reduce gas flaring, initiatives to reduce methane emissions, initiatives to call for a price of carbon, initiatives to work together on the deployment of carbon capture and sequestration. Is it enough? No, it is certainly not enough. The oil and gas companies would need to go much further because what they're proposing so far is inconsistent with the 2 degrees C limit and the associated global carbon budget. In the meantime, it's true that there are some competitiveness issues, and the group of 6 companies I mentioned are taking the lead, and their American counterparts are not at all where these European and this Saudi company are. So this is also why we need an intergovernmental agreement to set the global framework for their action. It's very, of course, important that individual companies or a group of companies collectively set the targets for themselves, but in the end, you also need the global policy framework to provide a coherent framework for action and address some of the competitiveness issues that would arise otherwise.
Thank you, Emmanuel. If we could just end with one final question from me and Helen.
You need to make even with them to basically big particular small islands. And with COP21, we all with those big, but we're trying to achieve that global framework to deal with those biggest and biggest space, or is that going to get that to more high-level negotiation?
Sure.
And for me, it was just, with less than a month left before the COP, what are your recommendations to MDP students here around the table, here in Paris, or even worldwide? How can students get involved? How can they help raise public awareness of this important event coming up?
Yes. Okay. So first, yes, the particular interests of the small island and developing states are taken very seriously in the negotiations, and one will probably have to find a way to refer to the 1.5 degrees Celsius and not just 2 degrees Celsius objective, and well, make sure that it is not completely off the table that this 1.5 degree limit can be achieved if we strengthen commitments. There is a separate area in the negotiations that is also extremely important and extremely hotly debated politically, which is the issue of loss and damage. And this is basically code for the impact of climate change that cannot be adapted to. And small island and developing states in particular requesting compensation for these impacts. So yes, this is very much part of the discussion, and we'll try to find both very serious ways of responding to these concerns, which in the meantime are acceptable to those who do not want to hear about the word compensation because it triggers lots of legal issues. So, but yes, this is right at the center of the negotiations. And to your more general question, I would say that your governments need you to put pressure on them, frankly, because yes, countries have all sorts of red lines and all have pretty narrow way in which they define their own national interests. But frankly, you need to be there to remind them about what is the global public good and how their national interest depends on this public good. It would also help us to find a deal that is better and not just an agreement that is suitable for countries, but also for citizens. And there is all sorts of social movements happening out there with this purpose in mind. There is in particular going to be a big march in Paris before the COP starts on the 29th of November, the Sunday before the heads of states arrive. The message of the march is that to change everything, we need everybody. So we hope to see you in the streets marching.
Thank you very much, Emmanuel, for taking time out of your crazy schedule to be here with us today. Thank you.
Thank you.